Now we get to the point where the experiencers, these four seated next to me, and then Dr. Jeff's observations, chronicle the actual experience that precipitated their death experience. So Kelly, take it away. And I think yours is very important, and you'll find out why when she tells you.
Yeah, so my near-death experience is a little unique in that I committed suicide. So it was something I did to myself. And that's in itself something that can be challenging to talk about, right? You know, to just be vulnerable enough to tell people I killed myself and I wanted to leave this body and I wanted to leave this family that loved me. And how could you do that? Why would you want that, right? So that is a big part for me that I had to overcome to be able to share my journey first. And so, you know, after my near-death experience, when I started to process what I had been through, was when I really started realizing that I had a message to share, right? Not just to hopefully lead people away from suicide ideation, but those who maybe have already experienced it through another loved one. And so that's a powerful piece, I think, that maybe is a little bit different than other people's NDEs.
Well, I think it's important because you give people the impetus to know that that's not a solution, but you don't have to denigrate the experience, right? You still honor where that individual was when they felt hopelessness or whatever precipitated the event.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So Barbara, I know your story, but it's pretty remarkable. So if you could tell people what was happening when you went into the operating room for your procedure.
Yeah, it was an x-ray table that I was on, and they were doing a myelogram. So they had injected iodine to the spinal cord at the back of my neck. And it was because the husband that I was married to had ruptured my L5-S1 disc in the bottom of my back. And I couldn't walk anymore. So they were checking to see with the myelogram if my spinal cord had been chipped by one of the pieces of the disc when it burst out. And so the x-ray techs were talking to each other, and I was laying on the table. They had told me to hold completely still, that I was not to move or I would have headaches for months afterwards. And so I was 31 years old, and I followed rules, and I followed what people told me to do. So I laid there, and they started tipping the table. Unfortunately, the x-ray tech was talking to the other x-ray tech and not paying attention, and no one in the room, neurosurgeon, orthopedic surgeon, they were both there prior to the surgery, which was going to happen the next day, and a nurse that was also in the room didn't see that the x-ray tech had his finger on the wrong button on the table, so it was raising my, lowering my head and raising my feet. So the dye that they had just injected into my spinal cord was flowing into my brain. So within about a minute and a half, first I felt very funny, like I was going to faint, and then within a minute and a half, I realized I should say something to someone because I was really starting to panic with the feelings that I was feeling of wanting to get out of there, the fainting feeling. And so then I realized I couldn't speak and I couldn't reach my hand out, and that really was panicking me. And I started hyperventilating and my eyes were rolling to the back of my head, and that's when the x-ray tech realized something was wrong, and so he looked at my face and saw my eyes rolling backwards, and he then made a face like, oh my God, and he realized he had made a mistake because he saw his finger was on the wrong button. So I just rose out of my body, then I shut my eyes in my body, and the next second I was up on the ceiling looking straight down at my body.
And then you talk about this, you looked at the monitor, and I want to talk to Dr. Jeff about this, but you flatlined, and when you saw that you had flatlined, you said, huh, I must be dead. But how can I be dead if I'm still conscious?
Yeah, I rose up on the ceiling. I initially said, when I looked down at my body and everybody in the room, I said, if I'm up here and that man is calling code blue, then I think I just died. And they were all doing different, two doctors were calling out orders, but most of the people in the room were following all the orders. And this one man brought in a heart monitor, and I didn't know what it was. So as I was up there on the ceiling, there was a feeling of a being there next to me, and it felt very eternal, and it felt very loving and accepting. I felt like I was wrapped in a beautiful, warm blanket of love. I lost all of the fear and all of the panic that I had felt from down below. And I was communicating with this being, saying how much I wanted to go back into my life to protect my children, because I knew that my then husband would hurt eventually, and he'd already started to hurt my 8-year-old son. So I ended up looking down and saying, you know, I need to go back into my life. And after saying that about 4 times, the neurosurgeon ended up saying to the orthopedic surgeon, too much time has passed, she's going to be brain dead, we need to do something. And so the orthopedic surgeon did a precardial thump on my chest, and he said, stand clear first, and everybody backed away from the table, and he pounded on my chest. And I didn't go back into my body. I watched my body react to the blow. And then he, up on the ceiling, the being that I had been saying that I wanted to go back to ended up speaking to me, and in this beautiful voice said, but if you go back, you'll still be in your marriage. What will you do? And I ended up seeing flashes of all of the incidents that had happened in the 7 years or so that I'd been married to him. And I had been trying to help him change and get rid of the anger issues that he had, and it hadn't worked. And I was able to think about all the things that I had done to try to help him change, and I came to the realization that he wasn't capable of changing, that I needed to get out of the situation. So I ended up saying to the being, if you let me go back, I promise you I'll get strong enough to leave him. And the second I said the word him, the orthopedic surgeon did a second precardial thump on my chest, which was probably only 30 seconds or even less after the first one. But it seemed like up there on the ceiling like it was 20 or 25 minutes that I was up there. And it restarted my heart, and I had an oxygen mask on my face, and I just shut my eyes up on the ceiling, and I opened my eyes a second later, and I had the oxygen mask on my face, and the doctor was right next to me because he just pounded my chest. And I looked at him and said, what just happened? And the nurse said, stop, don't talk, we need to stabilize you. So 20 minutes later, they finally took the oxygen mask off, and I said, what just happened? I was up on the ceiling and I could see and hear everything. And the neurosurgeon went, oh, brother. And so then the orthopedic surgeon didn't say anything, and everyone looked like they were interested in what I was going to say. So I proceeded to tell everyone what they had just done in those minutes that I was dead. And I validated everybody's actions. And then the neurosurgeon got so upset that he stormed out of the room and screamed, I'm not going to stand here and listen to this. And so then the orthopedic surgeon took my hand and said, that was just amazing. Tell me, what did it feel like? Tell me again what you saw. And he told me about 15, 20 years later that he was really wished that he could travel around with me the way that Dr. Jeff travels around with Jeff, but he would have to give up his medical career if he did that. But he was very grateful for me to talk about it to the world.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure, and Jeff, you can speak to this, Dr. Jeff, in a minute, but from the clinician standpoint, to advocate for the near-death experience is basically stepping outside of where their functionality is, right? And it doesn't necessarily invalidate it.
Right.
It complements it, as I'm sure Dr. Jeff will tell us. Let's go to Jeff Olson, and you can recount your experience. I know it pretty well, and you've told this story a lot, but it's very compelling.
Yeah, my near-death experience was a result of an automobile accident. I mean, when I graduated from college, I was married. We had 2 boys. I was 33 years old at the time, but we took a family road trip, a vacation, and it was on the return of that road trip that I lost control of the car. And it's a difficult part of the story. I believe I dozed off just a little bit and swerved, overcorrected. I mean, I was a young father. I was running my own ad agency. I was doing those, 12, 14, 16-hour days. We had taken this break, but I lost control of the car. I swerved. The car began to roll, not off the road, but down the road at 75 miles per hour. And it was a horrible automobile accident. I blacked out for the actual crash, but when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious. And the first thing I heard was my 7-year-old son crying hysterically in the back seat. And I'm like, I've got to get to my boy. I've got to get to my son. And that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was pinned either to the floorboard or the seat. I couldn't tell. There was the rancid smell of gasoline, all the broken glass. And I was completely unaware of my injuries. I mean, what had actually happened is both of my legs had been crushed. The left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My back had been damaged. My right arm had been completely torn out and almost torn off. The seat belt had cut through and ruptured all my intestines and torn me wide open. In fact, the femoral artery was exposed but not cut. I really should not have survived this crash. I was unaware of the injuries. I knew I was in pain. I knew I was struggling to breathe, and I knew I was struggling to maintain consciousness. But all I knew was my son was crying and I had to get to my boy. But that's when I realized that no one else was crying, and the brutal reality hit. And I was aware of at the scene that Tamara, my wife, was gone. She was killed instantly in the accident. And my youngest son, Griffin, just a toddler, was also killed in the crash. So it was in that despair, that darkness, that, oh my gosh, can't I get those 3 seconds back? What happened? That light came, and it was literally tangible light. I felt light come and surround me, as if it was comforting me in the darkest hell a man could ever be in. I felt like I was rising above the accident scene. Suddenly I could breathe, there was no pain, and I was even having the thought, how can I possibly be physically okay? Emotionally I was still distraught, but this comforting light, it was like I was delivered from that trauma.